I'm with Kerry Hellums this afternoon from Fredericksburg, Texas, and we're going to do a little talking about history. He has a new venue on the Encounter Truth platform called History Matters. And in visiting with him the other day, his wife actually said two words that have just stuck with me that I think are so relevant to today, and that is inconvenient history. Because reality is, and one of the things that is my pet peeve and makes me very angry is even when I was in school, starting back in the 60s, that our textbooks had already been greatly edited and altered and changed, and there were agendas and propaganda, and we were just totally naive to what was going on. And it wasn't until just a few years ago that I began to learn some truth about what was missing in our history books, and I'm continuing to learn. And what a different country and society we would be living in today if truth had been able to come forward all these years. I think there'd be a whole lot more respect between a lot of people and than what we have today. So, Kerry, when did your interest in history begin? Because it seems like it's been kind of with you almost your whole life.
I don't remember when the start of it was. My entire life has been geared in this matter of from growing up to the time period that did. I'll tell you one thing, I'm real thankful for the time that I did grow up in. I would not prefer we are purposed in such time as this. But from the very moment that I could hit the ground running, I was already portraying things of things that excited me at the time. I have a photograph taken in Christmas 1964 where I was fixing to go outside and play. And beside me I've got my Johnny Red cannon. That's something for you all to look up what that is. And also I was wearing my cavalry belt with a saber on one side and a pistol on the other, and a carbine over my shoulder, and wearing a Confederate gray hat with a Confederate battle flag on it that, by the way, I had gotten at Six Flags Over Texas.
Wow.
That they were sold very, very easily back in those days. So I don't remember a time when I was not involved with a time that was before my actual existence. So it's always been a part of me.
So from your earliest remembrance, did you accept history based on what you were being taught in school, or were you one of these bookworms that went and studied and researched your own facts?
Good question. There's, I think it came by honestly. What I found by the time I did get in school, which is first, second, third, fourth grade, fifth grade is when they really started pressing American history. But by the time I was in fifth grade, I already knew that the narrative was wrong.
Wow.
Due to that, I went to a school there named Sam Houston Elementary.
A good name.
And yes, it is. And we had a new teacher there. Her name was Mrs. Bilbrey. She was 21 years old, and all of us little 5-year-old fifth grade boys were all in love with Mrs. Bilbrey. Pretty young teacher, you know. But it came to a point where she was teaching American history, and it was going to the point of the war between the states. At that point, she turned the class over to me.
Wow.
For 3 days running for 1 hour a day to teach about the rest of the class, my peers, about the war between the states, because I had a better understanding of it than she did.
Wow. How did your classmates receive you teaching them?
They liked that because I related to them.
I bet.
I could speak it on their level. And that I could bring them in, make it excitement to them, because it was interesting because I could get very animated and be very first person with them, and then at the same time pull back and be a narrative. Of course, I didn't understand those things at the time, but that was part of what I was doing anyway.
Uh-huh.
And by the time you get into 7th and 8th grade and then ninth, I was butting heads with history teachers by then.
How did that affect your grades?
Oh, they usually I would have to walk out and earn a C.
Wow.
And the reason why is this: they had a narrative that they had to live by.
Yes.
I guess because what they would do, they would begin to teach something, whatever period of along our American heritage, and I knew that this was wrong due to where I had already studied things, or at least all of a sudden things didn't seem to equal up. So I would ask them a question.
Mm-hmm.
If Miss So-and-so, you said that this happened, then how come that person said this earlier, and by his actions he took there doesn't add up to the narrative of what you're saying to us here? Why is that true? Mm-hmm. Well, what it would cause were now the rest of the students around me start to raise their hands and say, yeah, that is a good question that Kerry brought up. So, and that brings me to another thought, then why this, why that? And what it got was, it got off their narrative.
Yeah.
And so usually they would say, Mr. Hellums, yes ma'am, I would like you to stay after class. All righty.
Mm.
And that was not for a good thing.
No.
It was to get me in trouble.
Yeah.
So I found then that we are taught a certain narrative that they must go by.
That hasn't changed between now and then either.
No, it hasn't.
No.
And this dates to the 60s, 1960s that I'm talking about.
Right.
Yes.
Okay, so the years have rolled by. This narrative, the old analogy of starting at one point, and if you're just off just a smidge from the start and you keep going, you're way off the mark by the time you get there. So roll it out 60 years.
Correct.
How far off are we from truth now?
It's we bury the truth real well. I don't want you to misunderstand me that we are good or bad or indifferent. We have a wonderful, colorful history about this nation. But many of the ones that should have been recognized are not. And when you find out that some of the ones that we've held up as heroes, well, they have a lot of flaws also.
Yeah.
That we are who we are. And why are we running from it? And why are we intimidated by it? So it was when I was in college that I had a professor at Midland College, and this professor taught history like he was telling a story. And so at the end of an hour and a half, I had just put down my pencil and trying to take notes. I was so enthralled with how he was talking it.
Uh-huh.
And it taught me, it showed me, this is what it's about.
Yeah.
And
so it captivated you, it pulled you in.
Because it made these characters that we have sat in these prisms of time and on these thrones or on these platforms, made them real.
Yeah.
Made them breathe. And made you realize that there's flesh upon this man. There's a mind behind him. He does have emotions and actions, and so does how he interacted. And so all of a sudden they became something to live and breathe. And now when I grasped a hold of the very ground that I walk upon, what is it that made me who I am? There's more to this than me.
Yeah.
And there's got to be more to it to all of us. And so if we don't go into this and search it out, then we become walking parodies of somebody else. No, we're more than this. We are all more than this. And this is what we've got to find out, because history, it's, as you put it, it's inconvenient.
Yeah.
Very inconvenient. And that's where the beauty of it is found. It's where the tragedy of it is found. Mm-hmm. That's where the magnificence of it is found. But that's where the love and hurt and the families and the death and the life is found. And that's what makes us who we are. That's what history's about.
So a lot of the things that are being talked about today, politically,
Yes.
across the nation,
Yes.
with all the the George Floyd and all of that came out, and then Black Lives Matter, and it just all has evolved and rode, and it kind of picked up that narrative again about reparations, and just all of this has been coming up, but so much of that history is incorrect because they don't talk about the slaves that were white or the indentured servants. Several things I've learned from you and a couple of
Yes. If you want to understand, if you really are interested, you cannot pick up an incident that happens today or tomorrow and live from that point forward, unless you get the backstory on it.
okay.
And this is where I am consistently confronted with people that are blissfully ignorant, and they love their ignorance.
Yeah.
And so the things you brought up here, let's talk about George Floyd. I could go in depth on this right now, but I will not. But I'll tell you, but that's one of the things you must look at. Who was this, and is it real? Black Lives Matter? Is that really what it talks about? Or is there a possibility that there's a big front and organization behind this on this innocent sounding front?
Yeah, it's a Marxist organization.
Question.
Yeah.
I got to think about this. That's the point. Think about it. Wake up. Wake up. All people, wake up. Let's go back. All of a sudden, if you center in on one racial group, which is interesting, there I use the term that the enemy uses. When you talk on one ethical, I think that's right. Yes, as they say.
Ethnicity.
And you got to talk through my Texanisms. There's a certain deal, but there's folks are all the same. You have blacks, you got whites, you got red, you got yellow, you got us all colors under the rainbow.
All shades of dirt.
Yes, it really doesn't matter. And so when you realize that one is more special than the other, that's not necessarily so. Let's walk through this whole storyline of humankind, and you will find that we all share the same hurts and the same victories and the same glories and the same disappointments. It's all through it. And I've traveled around the world 3 times, and I have found this. No matter where you are, whether it's Cambodia, Nepal, Central Europe, or Northern Europe, or South Africa, or in the Caribbean, or Mexico, or in any of the reservations or all over, you find that this main thing, we're all interested in the same thing, and it's home, it's family, it's income. How do we get by? It's all the same. We're all the same. So it's good to look at let's research and let's find out about ourselves. And that's what history's about.
You had brought up on the program this past week, History Matters on Encounter Truth, talking about how a lot of the initial slaves came in as indentured servants.
Correct.
And share about that, how that all initiated here in our country.
You will find that there's an enemy, I call it enemy front because they're trying to get everybody off track. What has been the number for we've all gone with is 1776. The new movement now is 1619. The 1619 movement is about this coming up with false fronts, false history, false narratives in order to get everybody thinking along one line. That's what lemmings do. They think along one line. So let's go to 1619. Let's take their number. Okay, 1619. Now you're coming out to where the Pilgrims won't land at Plymouth Rock and for another year yet, 1620. But you already had Jamestown established in the Virginia colony. Now, Dutch traders that are trading all over the world at this time, whatever they're running, have now traded for the slave markets of the western African coast. That many of them have been captured in combat from other African tribes. And these are already a slave trade that's been going on for several centuries as it is prior to 1619. So the Dutch now come to the new colonies, knowing that they're not well established yet, and offer them that we do have cargo here, and it's human cargo. What's left of them, that is, because many of them they've already sold, have brought them into the Caribbean and along the South Africa coast. 5 and 100 end up on North America, but they bring them in as indentured servants. When you realize you're facing a wilderness out here, and you're with the the Indians that are here, plus all the other elements, you're going to need help in order to do things. So they ended up purchasing them for paying off their certain bound that they what money they have paid. Okay, I buy this certain individual for an X amount. Now you're in my indentured servant for the next several years till you work out that debt. But realize that while I have you, it's my responsibility to feed, clothe you, house you, and do all of these things. And so this is what would happen, indentured servitude. But also this has already happened with indentured servants coming from Europe.
That was normal.
So it was normal
over there.
They it didn't matter white or black.
They had paupers prisons and things like that.
That's in fact Georgia was a paupers was a penal colony, just like Australia was. That's what it was.
And I never knew that. Yeah.
So you already have these coming in that they have to pay off their debt, and once they pay off their debt, they become free men and women to do as the ones that had so-called purchased them in order to work for them. Now you have the freedom to do as I do. So this is what you're asking me about is where did slavery come about? Slavery won't arrive on the North American continent till 1655, not 1619, and not with the first black man that was here. In fact, it will take those many years for it to happen due to Anthony Johnson is his name. Anthony Johnson will come into this country as one of these indentured servants from Africa. And he will gain his freedom and soon have his own property in the Virginia colony, and he's raising crops and everything, and he hired a person named John Casor, C-A-S-O-R, from a neighboring from a neighbor, and had him work and doing some wood, very special woodwork in his house, putting up things, flooring, and one thing after another. But when the time came for him to give him back to the neighbor, Anthony Johnson went to court to keep John Casor as his indentured servant indefinitely.
Wow.
So he took it to court there in Virginia, and Virginia ruled in his favor, and therefore he set up that now John Casor will be his slave
forever.
His life.
Wow.
And so slavery was born in 1655. This was a ruling in 54, came in 1655, that now slavery is legal in the new colonies.
And this was in Virginia?
And this was in Virginia. Interesting to take note is Johnson is a black man owning a black man. Anthony Johnson is a black man owning John Casor, who is also a black man.
And so he was the first slave owner in the
slave
colonies.
owner in America.
Okay.
Was a black owning a black. Now they would rule in 1670. The courts of Virginia, I'm speaking of, would rule in 1670 that it is legal for blacks to own blacks, Indians to own Indians, or blacks to own Indians and vice versa, and whites to own blacks, but you could not own a white slave, but you could have a white indentured servant. And that is where all of these will go along.
So the European trade continued to bring in some white indentured servants, correct, into our country?
Correct, and that will happen all the way up to just into the 1860s even. I mean, it'll carry on, yes.
And they were they treated the same as slaves, and for the most part?
Actually, you will find that by the 1860s, most of these were coming into the north and working in the factories up north.
Interesting.
And and the factories up north were not responsible for their well-being. They did not furnish them housing, did not furnish them food, and did not furnish them any clothing. You're on your own for what pennies I pay you a day. It's up for you to make it. After all, you're an indentured servant. If you live through this, good, and if you don't, I'll just pick up another one at the dock when they land over here in New York or Boston or wherever.
So both blacks and whites, or any other shade, were taking in some type of slave or indentured servant of any color.
Any color, and you got to realize that sometimes these were put in due to the poverty for where they lived, whether in Europe, whether it's in Ireland or whatever, that oftentimes they would sell themselves into this or sell their children into this in order to get them out of the poverty for which they're living in back where they come from, because they knew that there's a possibility that they could, once they work out their what they owe, now they become free individuals to have a new home, a new place, and start whatever. So what I'm telling you is not this is all bad or evil doings. This is the time for which they lived, and
Right.
this is what they were doing.
Well, this was better than being in a pauper's prison.
In a pauper's prison,
Yeah.
is once you serve there, you're there because you cannot pay off your debt.
No.
This way, you can pay off your debt.
And that even goes back to biblical times.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so.
Absolutely. And I want it fully to recognize that slavery is still going on today, and
Yes.
it's not just an American thing. America was caught up in it, just like every other country on this planet. And so, with what's going on today, it's even more so, and much more wicked than what you really realize.
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't want to just center on the only thing about this issue of slavery. My point of view is this: regardless of how you got here, you're here.
Yeah. Out of all the places to be born or to live.
That's right.
There's nowhere, as they say, we better take care of America. There's nowhere else to go.
That's right.
That's why everyone is trying to move to America, and there is not a mass exodus away.
That is correct.
Yeah.
But truth is something that we must search out. Truth is the hardest thing to deal with. Truth.
And this poses a very inconvenient history because it does not fit today's narrative or the way we've been taught and trained and the way we've been, we're supposed to even think.
Absolutely not. You will find that the narrative of today is what they want you to think. Because if we can get everybody thinking one thing, then you're easy to be led. But if all of a sudden you have a different thought and a thought that's this doesn't fit into the narrative, because all of a sudden as you begin to question the narrative, you'll find out, man, 2 and 2 is equaling 5 here. Something's out of whack. So now's the time to start backtracking and find out just why is this not the truth of the matter? Because the truth of the matter has been buried. I think it was Mark Twain that wrote it in one of his books. I think it was Huckleberry Finn that was questioned. And Finn, being a very country boy and very down to earth and very honest thing, and they said, well, do you know what, Finn, do you know what the truth is? And his answer was, I reckon truth is always the hardest thing to do at the time. And I have found that to be absolutely right. It's the hardest thing at this certain moment, and that's the truth way to go.
So, at what point in time do you believe They started adjusting our understanding in regards to slavery, indentured servants, and who owned who, and all of that.
From the very beginning.
Okay.
They have to. They have to, because powers that are being have always got to hide what has come before. It has to, in order to gain power. Power and strength is also money. So therefore, if I'd told you the truth about everything, man, I wouldn't have this power and I wouldn't have this strength. In order to manipulate you. Manipulation. Manipulation, manipulation. So as you go, you will also find that it's usually the victor of the battle that's going to write the narrative. Because the other one isn't here to tell the story. And what is left of them won't have the platform in order to tell it. Well, then there's a whole side of the story that we haven't heard yet, right?
Absolutely.
Exactly. There sure is. And so this is where we find that, and so what will happen if you have a narrative, you will find it to begin to start excluding various groups of people, and excluding even your own, where you may come from. And all of a sudden you will have to accept the narrative from that certain point of view, from that certain region, or that certain a political thought. Well, then therefore that tells me the truth is buried, and we're not hearing it.
So a lot of things happened around the Civil War.
Yes, including the very name of it. It was not civil, and it was not a war that was trying to take over the government. A civil war is about two sides of the same people trying to gain power of the control of the government. That is not what that war was about.
What was the Civil War about?
It was not the Civil War. We have not. We're now in the process of a civil war, in trying to gain the thought and the power of government as we speak. The war that you're speaking of, that was fought between the late unpleasantness of 1861 through 1865, was, we can call it many things. It was the war of the interpretation of the Constitution. It was the war of, it was Lincoln's War, I've heard it said quite often. Or from another part of the country, it's called the War of the Rebellion. Or from one says it's a war between the states, or the War of Northern Aggression. It has several different numbers or callings.
So does that mean that the different parties that were battling it out during that time were doing it for different purposes?
Yes, because when you use the word civil war, that means that we're one people. We were not. There was two nations warring against one another. There was the nation of the United States of America battling against the Confederate States of America. There were two separate governments here. And one government wasn't trying to take over the stance of the other government, but the other government was trying to take over the stance of the other government.
Okay, so which is which for those that
Well, you
need
have
a
the
lesson?
all-powerful central government that was trying to establish itself. These are things that you're going to have to tune in to get the full truth about. But you have a country that had already fought one war under the Articles of Confederation and beaten the English. And now this same country was battling the other side of the country for having the same Articles of Confederation, fighting against it. Strange. Very strange. But yet you claim that one was fighting to enslave men that are of a certain color. Well, I'll tell you, when you start researching it, you will find that narrative is not true.
Yeah.
And that's where you must tune in and search out, because there's good and bad wherever you look. And most men have gone to war from the beginning of time for not so much as fame, but as far as to get money, to gain power, to gain property. And if you trace the money line, and that's usually where you find where most of the wars begin.
I'm reminded of what's called, I believe, the Black Robe Regiment. That didn't it arise out of this time period?
The Black Robe Regiment is a terminology that's used during. It was these men were the men of the cloth, so to speak.
So American Revolution,
American
okay.
Revolution, and very colorful history on that. In fact, I'll probably do a program on that. But that's you see a hint of that. There was a movie made several years ago called The Patriot, starring Mel Gibson and such, and you have a hint of that by one of the characters in it when he is the minister at a local church, and he volunteers and goes to war alongside the rest of them. They're all volunteers to go fight for their state of South Carolina. And there's a lot of colorful history of that, so I'll cover that on one of my programs.
Okay. Here in Texas, the battle we think of the most is the Alamo.
Yes, ma'am.
And a lot of that was all coming about the same time as well. What interesting bits of history can we pull out of the Alamo besides remembering it?
Well, that's the problem. Most of Texas has forgotten it. They don't even know what it's about. If they were, they'd be up in arms about what the city of San Antonio and our Representative George P. Bush is trying to do to it right now.
Yeah, he married a San Angelo girl.
Yeah. And so when you realize that the Alamo, where and how it was fought, and the colorfulness of this, of anywhere from 185 men to possibly 220 were inside that fortress when Santa Anna's armies came out of Mexico to put down the so-called rebellion. Now, Santa Anna was a dictator. He had overthrown the Constitution of 1824, which was a Spanish Constitution that most settlers in Texas were much in agreement with. And they were settling under that. They have just come from the republic of a constitutional republic that have their own representatives of America. Now, these men are still remembering that the War of 1812 and the war against Britain of the Revolution. When you consider that Davy Crockett was born in 1786, well, the Constitution had just been written in 1779. And so these men are the first generation coming out of this. Sam Houston, also born in 1790s. Going back to Jim Bowie, born in the early, also. So I think he was 39 at the time, and so was Travis, 29 in 1809, born in South Carolina. And all these men are now going to fighting for this to have a say-so in their government in Mexico City. But Santa Anna wasn't having any part of that. And so you will find he will march an army north, and he will have to force many of them coming off the Yucatan Peninsula to even march north with him by his regulars.
Wow.
In order to fight in this cold country of Texas.
Oh my.
Yes.
Cold.
Cold.
Wow.
It was a blue norther that blew in that day in March of 1836, that it was so cold that it was now getting into the 20s at night at the time of this battle. Now many of Santa Anna's soldiers were still barefooted marching up from the Yucatan.
Burr.
Yes. So these men these were men. And so they were facing each other down at this point. And Travis knew what he was facing. This is why I find it interesting. Read his letter when he sends it out for all to come to my defense now, you that are out there. But he words it this way: "Come, we are fighting for all things that are dear to the American."
To the American. Mean? Interesting.
What is dear to the American?
Family.
All right, see, they already recognize themselves as a different people. And this is what we have lost. So these men went to their graves fighting for what is true. Give me liberty or give me death. I shall fight it on this line. Or even right up to when we stood at Bastogne. And when the Nazis punched through in the Ardennes forest in 1944, winter of 44, came through December the 16th at Bastogne, when they asked these Americans to surrender, and he sends back the word nuts. And the Germans looked at that, nuts? What does this mean? Nuts? What do they mean by nuts? We are Americans. We stand and we fight it on this line if it takes everything. Well, and so they did.
Not quite the generation we have at hand today.
What about this generation? Say again?
Well, this generation...
What about it? Well, this generation has a lot of things and opportunities before them.
Yes, they do.
And they also have the same, a lot more than all the ones that have come before. But this generation is the generation that has had the most manipulation played upon them.
Mm-hmm.
And by this, they're coming out of preschool and all this other things. They've been taken away from the family from the very start, where they don't even know if I'm a boy, if I'm really a boy, or if I'm a girl, if I'm really a girl. Or so on and so on.
Yeah.
My point is, I'm making this to you, is that they confuse them from the very start. And so if they confuse them on those basic matters, then I can confuse you all the way through with now how I teach history. Well, I'm not here to teach you about Travis, Crockett, Bowie, Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant, Abraham Lincoln, Dwight Eisenhower, or even George Washington. I'm not here to teach you any of that. I'm here to get you to speak the narrative from my political point of view, because we've been playing politics with history since Dewey took it over, who was, by the way, the Dewey who set up the whole American system. The whole American system of free school, free all this, came from a communist thought that was put in place in the 1820s. It's history. It's fact. And Dewey puts in there, he had been in Europe and had helped and was a very dear friend of Lenin. He helped with the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. So he came here and established that way in 1927 in the school systems of the United States. It didn't matter if they become a collective thought in 1 year. We've got a long range idea that's going to go out hundreds of years, because give us 2 or 3 generations, we will have them all having a collective thought. So that you will see the history books begin to change in the first printings of 1927, 1928. So you read the history books of 1932, start looking quite different than the history books of 1924. So,
where can you find these history books nowadays?
You have to go and find them. I'm not telling you where, you just got to go dig them up and find them. I've got one at the house that was written in 1882. And when I read that history, they're very pointed about America to the very nth detail, that they even break down each of the states and their constitutions and each history of the individual states in order to combine into the national, to the federal narrative of this country. Well, now, look today, you in a history book, I think we're going back to 1877 now. Isn't it interesting to go to 1877? This is 1 year after our centennial of 1776, 1876. 1777 is also the year that that will end the Reconstruction era on the South. Huh, very interesting. And this is also the time when the Industrial Revolution is just starting and the big push of collective socialist, communist thought will enter into America in force in the late 1880s through the 1890s.
Isn't a lot of what we're seeing today what Bonhoeffer wrote about, that he saw coming into Germany before the war?
Mm-hmm. Same thing. First they took this group of people, then they took that group of people. It didn't matter to me much and all this, and then finally they're rounding me up also. But see, this is where we must speak forward. And it don't matter what ism you are, if it's Nazism, communism, socialism, radicalism, all it goes is they all end the same thing. We all think, well, fascism is over here on the right hand and communism's over here on the left hand. No, they're in the same side. They all lead to the same thing, and it all comes out of collective thought. On the other side is no government whatsoever, where it's full freedom and do whatever. Well, see, and then that could go into chaos in a way. So we come back on the right side is the balance of this. And that's where we balance, and this is where we have a constitutional republic government in order that all people may have the right of liberty, the right of freedom, the right to speak and know the truth, the right of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And without that balance, we don't have that.
Yeah, and I think for the most part, our generation on down really hasn't been taught the difference between democracy and what a republic is.
True. Democracy is an evil thing. Democracy will lead to
Mob rule.
Well, democracy leads to actually what it will is same thing as a monarchy. Same thing with Nazism. Same with communism. All this will lead. All this leads to an oligarchy. An oligarchy is where you settle back on. When you have a democracy, that will settle back to, same thing with a monarchy, you will come into an oligarchy. An oligarchy, what is that? That's where it's ruled by a group of so-called lawyers, judges, and rulers. And even if you have a monarchy, there's no such thing as a true monarchy, a true king. He has an oligarchy that tells him what to do. And so when you have an oligarchy that tells you what to do, then therefore that overrules the people on the street.
Mm-hmm.
So a democracy is simply this. I have 100 people. 51 of them decide that this hat is white. But 49 say, no, that's more of a yellowish color. I'm sorry, the democracy rules. This is a white hat. All of you, because you don't agree with us, you go to jail. Great, that's democracy rule.
Yeah.
Okay, I got to swing 2 votes to my side. That's it. And now they become the ruling bunch. Well, this is where all of our so-called politicians, and I use that fully, politicians, not statesmen, politicians, we've got to protect our democracy. Well, our democracy this, we've got the greatest democracy. While we're going to go into these countries and create democracies. Oh, so you're going to go in there and create oligarchies. Is that what you're going to do? Speak the truth. You can't speak the truth because you're part of the democracy. Democracies are exactly what destroys us. We are a constitutional republic. Although, yes, we've been compromised since 1871. Nonetheless, we are a constitutional republic, and we must stand upon that. So democracy is a thing that even our forefathers that wrote the Constitution were adamantly against. They knew what it would be. It would end up in that it destroys all power, all strength, all rights. You don't have rights under a democracy. In fact, a democracy can come and tell you, your 10 neighbors can come to your house and say, I don't like the color of your house, paint it this color. I don't like your dog and I think you ought to kill it. I don't think you should have guns in your house. You need to get, I don't like the way your hair's cut. I don't like the truck you're driving. You get rid of that Ford and start buying Chevys, or vice versa.
Yeah.
There's your democracies.
Yeah.
They're here to kill you. No, we are not a democracy.
We could go on for hours
Yes, we
and
could.
hours,
And
and that's what History Matters
That's
is
why-
all about on
that's-
Encounter Truth. I hope that this whetted the appetite of a lot of people to begin to, what was it I wasn't taught in school? What is it I don't understand? Why do I think this way, but it's based on wrong information?
That is
So
true.
there's a lot,
History matters.
and it's an inconvenient history.
It's inconvenient, but it is lovely and it is colorful.
Yeah.
Come visit with me. We'll have a good time at it.
Thank you so much for your time
Well, thank you.
today.
It's my pleasure.
And yes, Monday nights, 9 o'clock,
Yes, ma'am.
Central Time
Central
Zone.
Time, right here in the good old Lone Star State.
Amen.
Amen.
Amen. All right. Well, I appreciate it. Have a good one.
All right.
Thanks.
Y'all take care.